Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I'm your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support the History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Two great ways to support the History of the Papacy are leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. And another really great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going and joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you'll be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Yoren, William B., Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, William H., and Judy at the Alexandria level. We have Dappo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Alex the Great, Amma the Great, Frederick the Great, and Jeffrey the Great. And with that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Changing gears a bit to Victorian religion, it's a really complicated time in this 19th century of religion. There's a push to more religiosity, and then there's also a push to more secularization and less religion. What was maybe the really broad strokes of religion in Victorian Britain?
Well, just before she comes to the throne, you've got the Oxford movement, which is people like Cardinal Newman and Manning, and they have a lot of disciples in Oxford University who want effectively to bring back Catholic liturgical practices to the Church of England. And the Church of England really doesn't like it. The Church of England felt it benefited greatly from the Reformation by getting autonomy. It no longer had to answer to the Pope in Rome. And the idea of these Oxford divines who love the idea of the Latin Mass, they love the idea of the ancient and highly aesthetic nature of the Roman Catholic Church, as opposed to the anti-idolatry of the Anglican Church. They tried to change things, and it met great resistance. The Church of England did change. Some of those people who were influenced by the Oxford movement brought certain what became known as Anglo-Catholic practices back into the church. We had all the rood lofts and the Christ on the cross over the entrance of the chancel. They were all taken down in the 16th century. Some of them were put back up again. You can still go to churches in England today, and there's still a few dozen churches that were redecorated, reordered by the Oxford movement, who had priests there who started painting pictures on the walls and painting screens. All these things are whitewashed out at the time of the Civil War and the Reformation because they were deemed to be idolatrous. And so that came back. But at the same time, as people became more prosperous, and also with the advent of Darwin and Darwinism, and the notion that the biblical ideas of the creation were perhaps rather fanciful, this did breed secularization. And the rise of science, people like T.H. Huxley, who was known as Darwin's bulldog, the work that Darwin did, the work that other scientists did, which said there wasn't a creation, there was evolution, and the Bible saying everything started whatever it was 6,000 years ago is nonsense. It all started millions of years before that. As those ideas began to drip down, and they dripped down very fast as science was taught more widely in schools, particularly in the last 2 or 3 decades of the 19th century, people became more secular. And the Church of England, which then as now predominated in England, the Church of England was fighting a losing battle to keep its adherents. And it lasted longer, and it still survives in areas where there are old established families who have been sending people to the same church for hundreds of years. In those areas where there's been great social mobility and disruption, it survives less easily. And that process started in the late 19th century. But it starts even as early as someone like Thomas Carlyle, who was born in 1795. And Carlyle, when he was a little boy, when he was 6 or 7 years old, at the turn of the 18th into the 19th century, famously saw some wheelbarrows in a shop, and having been told by his parents that God created everything, said to his parents, well, did God create the wheelbarrow? And Carlyle, as a very clever boy, knew that the wheelbarrows had actually been made by men who had cut down trees and made planks of wood out of them and made a wheelbarrow. And he began his own drift away. Dr. Arnold, who tried to capitalize on the Oxford movement and tried to inculcate into his pupils the importance of a Christian religious life, found them questioning the whole nature of Anglicanism, the whole nature of Christianity and the teaching of Christianity. Matthew Arnold said of Carlyle, who had begun this process of secularization or theism rather than Christianity, said of him, well, he led us out into the desert and left us there. We didn't know where to go next. His friend Arthur Hugh Clough, who wrote the famous poem "Say Not the Struggle Naught Availeth," which everybody thinks was about religion ultimately prevailing, or a religious Christian idea ultimately prevailing, could not stay at Oxford because he could not subscribe to the 39 Articles of the Church of England. And he had to do that. To become a fellow of his college at Oxford, he had to do that. And he said, well, I'm sorry, I just don't think I believe it all anymore. And so you've got highly educated men brought up in a strict religious tradition who are suddenly saying, actually, a lot of this is a fairy tale. What we're learning about science and what we observe with our own eyes suggests that there's a little bit more to life than God ordering everything, that actually human beings have got some role in it as well. And so it does, the whole European mind, not just in Britain, but the whole Protestant mind across Europe, becomes secularized in the 19th century. And Britain leads this, but it also happens in the Low Countries. It happens in Germany, in the Protestant part of Germany. And it takes a lot longer to get into societies such as France, particularly Spain and Italy, which are very rigidly Roman Catholic. But obviously, throughout the 20th century, secularization has spread there as well. And it's spread for the same reason that it spread in Britain, which was that the knowledge of science and the breadth of thought that had come into philosophy as a result of science made, first of all, very educated people change their minds about religion, and then this dripped down through society.
The Church of England, it seems like it was really in a difficult position, that it's getting pulled in one way to the Anglo-Catholics, and then in another way, a really very different way, to the Unitarians and the Methodists and these Baptist groups. How did the Church of England try and find a place to exist and be the Church of England in this really complicated era?
Well, they found it easier to accommodate Anglo-Catholicism because obviously they had much in common with that. And the Church of England, famously a broad church, said that it would accommodate aspects of Catholic practice and leave it up to its congregations to decide what sort of priest they wanted. The one thing that was absolutely non-negotiable was the 37th article of the Church of England, which is called of the Civil Magistrates, which ends with the rather menacing phrase, "The Bishop of Rome hath no jurisdiction in this realm of England." And provided no priest got up and said that actually he was ultimately responsible to the Pope, he could get away with it. It was slightly harder to deal with nonconformism, the Methodists and the Baptists and the Unitarians that you talk about, because they just felt that the Church of England was decadent and didn't really believe in God. And so, if you like, they were anti-secularists. But they didn't also believe in establishments. They didn't believe in hierarchy. And they flourished, and they still do flourish, in the industrial towns. All over England, you'll see nonconformist chapels. But the real concentration of nonconformists was in Lancashire and Yorkshire, in the big industrial areas, and to an extent in the northeast around the coal mining areas of Newcastle on Tyne and places such as that, and shipbuilders there. And it was just very straightforward, unadorned, old-fashioned Christianity. But there was no flummery to it. There was no ritual or not what the Church of England would recognise. And the Church of England did lose people to that. And when the Church of England tried to set up churches, and you go around England today, and there are beautiful late Georgian, early Victorian churches in all our industrial towns. Many of them struggled. To get a congregation, because the people who had moved there had either already become secularized, or if they hadn't, they found the great simplicity of nonconformism to be something very much to their taste. The Church of England in rural areas was known as the Tory party at prayer, and local parishes would be controlled, and would have been controlled for centuries, by the local landowner. The local landowner would quite often decide who became the priest in that parish, and they would endow the church with money. They'd sit in the biggest pew in the church, at the front of the church, and everybody else knew their place. And that sense of social order was, nonconformists thought it was had no biblical precedent at all, and it was entirely mercenary. It was entirely materialistic, and they wanted no part of it. And so they had their own attitude to Christianity, which stripped itself of those social traditions, if you like, of the Church of England. But by the end of the century, nonconformism is very strong, and the Church of England has begun its decline, which it still continues in today.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Scott Rank's History Unplugged podcast and other great podcasts. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors. You've brought up the Oxford movement. Could you maybe give us a little more background on the Oxford movement and how it fits in with the Victorian era?
Well, I say it was John Henry Newman and Cardinal Manning and other people who thought like them in Oxford, and it was about restoring elements of Catholic liturgy and practice and worship to the Church of England. And they went out and decorated their churches. As I say, if you go into an English church today in most parts of the country, it will quite often be unchanged since the Reformation in the 16th century, and it will have whitewashed walls. It won't have graven images anywhere of saints or biblical figures, and there'll be no wall paintings and no real ornament. And what the Oxford movement did was, during that wave of church building that took place in the 1830s and 1840s, they started to use what they called polychromatic decoration inside churches. There are one or two very famous churches in this country where all the walls were adorned with painted panels. They did put rood screens up. They did put images of saints in niches, and they tried to make churches look as churches would have looked before 1534. And when they wanted to go further, and the Church of England said, absolutely not. If you want to do that, join the Catholic Church. People did. Newman famously joined the Roman Catholic Church and converted. Manning did as well. They just decided that there was no future for them as they saw religion in the Church of England. And with Catholic emancipation, which took place in 1829 in this country, which meant you could freely worship as a Roman Catholic and you could have the vote and owned property as a Roman Catholic. You had all the same civil rights as a Protestant. There was no bar to people joining the Catholic Church, and partly because many people converted because they liked the idea of Catholicism, but also because of the large influx of migrants from Ireland during the 1840s and 1850s. They started to build big Catholic churches, and most big English towns have a big Catholic church. Some of them have Catholic cathedrals, and they're all built in that period in the strict Gothic style. And if you go inside them, they look just like the high Anglican churches of the time as well. And a lot of interest has been invested and money has been spent on various ornaments and adornments. And the Church of England just had to put up with it. There was nothing that they could do about it.
When people like Manning and Newman moved on from just wanting to sort of adorn the churches with smells and bells and actually went to becoming actual Catholics, they were Victorians, they were British. So it's not just immigrants coming in. What did people think about that amongst British society, the high society, you might say?
I think a lot of people thought it was rather unusual. I mean, there were surviving some very grand Roman Catholic families in this country. The Premier Duke in England is the Duke of Norfolk, and he is a Roman Catholic, and he was in the 19th century. For 300 years, he and his predecessors had to keep very quiet about it, and they couldn't practice their religion openly. But when English Protestant men, and it was all men, decided to become Catholics and train for the Catholic priesthood, I think a lot of their fellow Englishmen just thought, well, live and let live. That's what they want to do. Let them get on with it. I mean, that was a great feature of Victorian society. Everybody thinks the Victorians were repressive and proscriptive people. They weren't. There was a lot of hypocrisy going on. And if people wanted to do things that were largely considered harmless to others, they were allowed to do them. And that included joining the Roman Catholic Church. These people would have been regarded as eccentric rather than as evil. People would say, well, why on earth does he want to do that? But no one tried to stop them. And indeed, Gladstone, when he was Prime Minister, Gladstone was a fierce Anglican. He would have Newman in to Downing Street for breakfast once every couple of months, and they'd chat over breakfast about religious matters. And Gladstone, who was a great theologian himself, was sufficiently intellectually curious to want to talk to Newman about it and to want to try and determine why he was doing it. And I think Gladstone was worried he'd missed something, that there was something there so obvious that he should be embracing it as well. We don't, in this day and age, have politicians of such intellectual heft and who are so interested in philosophical issues such as this. But in those days, for Gladstone, that was quite normal for him, and he thought about it deeply, as anybody who reads his diaries will see.
What did people think about this Oxford movement? Would you classify them? Were they reactionaries? Were they, in a way, conservative? I have a hard time wrapping my mind around what exactly these thinkers, how they fit in.
People thought they wanted to turn the clock back to before 1534, when the Church of England was founded. They thought that there was... In England at about the same time, there was a thing called the Eglinton Tournament. And, we've all seen films recreating medieval tournaments, jousting. You've got the fair damsel sitting up in the stands with her elderly father, and two knights will joust and try and win her favour. And there was that was a great display of Victorian interest in medievalism. The way we built our churches in the 19th century in the pure Gothic style was another representation of that interest in medievalism. And what the Oxford movement seemed to be was an extreme version of that interest in medievalism, to go back to a time when the Pope controlled religion in England, and when the King of England had to do fealty to the Pope, and he reigned, he either reigned by the grace of the Pope, or if he misbehaved, as King John did in the 13th century, he had an interdict put on him, and England was thrown out of the Catholic communion until Henry III went and said sorry and behaved himself. And that was what the Oxford movement was viewed as trying to do. It was viewed as saying, look, Protestantism is an aberration. We made this change 300 years earlier. I think we now can be grown up enough to realize that we were wrong, and we now need to revert back to Roman Catholicism and with the Pope as the head of the Church in England. But the Church of England had such wealth, almost all of it stolen from the Roman Catholic Church, by the way, but it had such wealth and such power that it said, we're not going anywhere. But it was powerful enough to be magnanimous and to say, all right, we're not going anywhere, but we will agree to allow you to practice your strange religion or your strange version of Christianity in the way that you wish in our church, providing you don't start saying that the Pope has authority over the church. And those who did want the Pope to have authority over the church were told to get lost and go and join the Roman Catholic priesthood, which some of them did.
How did the Victorians view Europe and what was going on in Europe?
Well, I mean, Queen Victoria was related to most of Europe, certainly by the end of her reign. The Kaiser of Germany was her grandson. The Queen of Spain was her granddaughter. It was, and the British aristocracy had very strong links with the French, German, and Italian aristocracy. There was great interplay between Britain and Europe, particularly once the railways came. And, the well-to-do would travel all around Europe. And in the well-to-do, it included the political class. And so we had very close links, and it was regarded as the mark of an educated man to speak French, and French was a universal language of diplomacy. And so when people went abroad from that class, they were able to communicate with others of their class very freely. Some, of course, spoke Latin to each other, which every educated person around Europe was still taught in those days. I mean, we think of England as being a great centre of classical education. Germany probably led the world in classical studies, even more so than Italy in the 19th century. So, we all regarded, after the Napoleonic Wars, when we finished fighting France, and there was no longer a megalomaniac anywhere in Europe who wanted to rule the whole of Europe, for 100 years, we all got on pretty well. It was between 1815 and 1940. It's only when the Austrians want to start a war with Serbia in 1914, and the Russians come in on their side, and the Germans come in on the other side, and the French come in on the Russian side, and all hell breaks loose, that things go wrong. But there's a sense during the 19th century that we're all, although the southern half of Europe is Roman Catholic and the northern half is Protestant, that we have a common Christian civilization, and we have common values, and we all look pretty much the same. We might dress differently. And as much as, I say, intermarriage at the highest level. So there's no suspicion of Europe. And of course, the Victorian period is a period other than the Crimean War, which lasts 2 years and is over an obscure issue about who runs a church somewhere in the Crimea between the French and the Russian. There are no hardships. Europe is just a place where we go to have recreation. Our real concentration, certainly after 1880, when the scramble for Africa begins, is with our empire. And, throughout the early years, we're still settling places like Canada and New Zealand and Australia and the Cape. And, of course, India becomes more and more important. And after 1858, we rule India directly. It had been done by the East India Company before then. So that's what we're really thinking about. And then after 1880, the book we're talking about, High Minds, finishes in 1880. We get the scramble for Africa, and we try and exploit as much of Central and Southern Africa as we possibly can. So that's our international priority. We don't worry too much about Europe. We seem to get on quite well with Europe for most of the 19th century.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. This time period is really the time period when the United States goes from really almost and semi-important, but really a rural nation to a nation that can stand with any of the nations in the world. What influence did the Victorian era have on America? Because to me, it seems like everything that I saw in the book, it had a huge effect on the development of the United States during this key period.
Well, I know that Gladstone very strongly sided, obviously, with the North in the Civil War. And the idea, I mean, we had renounced slavery from, 1807, and we banned the slave trade in our empire in 1833. And we found the idea of slavery, appalling. And we could not support the South in what they were doing. And I think that there was a great deal of British political influence on Lincoln and on other people in the Union about how America should develop. And I think a lot of American ideas were imported from England. I mean, just one example, Charles Dickens going over to America regularly and doing speaking tours where he'd read his books. And, the way that well-to-do Americans dressed, in frock coats and top hats, and ladies in crinolines, that was copied directly from British fashion. I think the fact there was a common language and there was for that reason, a common literature, and of course, very much a common inheritance. Your Civil War takes place only just over 80 years after independence. We do have a very strong influence. Where I think America succeeds in a way that we don't is it becomes better later in the 19th century at modernizing. It becomes better at using technology as well as developing technology. It becomes, although as I say, black people have a very hard deal in America right up until the middle of the 20th century, it's a more classless society. There aren't any of those old hierarchies. There's no aristocracy in America. I know there are people in America who think they're aristocrats, but in America, because in the late 19th century, it's become a classless society to a great extent in the way that Britain isn't. And it doesn't have those old structures of hierarchies. It is able to offer opportunity in a way that attracts immigrants. And of course, it's got unlimited natural resources as well, in a way that little countries like Britain can't have. So while I think we had a cultural influence, I think America was always going to stand on its own 2 feet and move away in a direction from us. But I mean, even today, as I say, nearly 250 years after independence, America is borrowing ideas from Britain just as Britain borrows ideas from America. And this is because we still have a very prominent shared culture in which we put in probably almost as much as America does.
Just to wrap up and to put a little bow on this, what's maybe just one thing that some people should take away with that the Victorians did that really impacts us today?
I think the growth of the railways, actually. I think the development of railways in Britain and what the rest of the world saw happening to British life, the British economy, physical and social mobility, the opening up of ideas, the exploitation of technology, that's what the Victorians gave to the world, really. And that's what happened in this period. But also there was the great thing about the Victorians was they were high-minded. That's why I called the book High Minds. They were high-minded, but they believe in improving people and they believe in improving the country. And part of that belief was that they could, if they put their minds to it, they could do anything. They weren't defeatist. If the Victorians needed to do something, whether it was put a railway track through something or get rid of slums and do new building, they did it. They didn't allow anything to stand in the way. One reason why in this very old country where I live, Great Britain, there aren't that many medieval buildings in our towns is the Victorians just pulled them down because they said they may be pretty and old, they may be part of our heritage, but they're not functional. We need to have new, bigger, better buildings that we can put central heating systems into. And they wouldn't let anything stand in their way. We view them as being stuffy and old-fashioned, but they were incredibly progressive. And their exploitation of technology was something that, an example they set to the world, and that actually parts of the world, notably America, learned from that example and did much better with it than we did.